Hey guys, Z here. I think if there's one thing I tend to look forward to in FEH besides the new heroes each month are the monthly batch of refines we get. It's a good way to redefine what a unit can do and give them a second lease at life. Of course, that won't always be the case. Some units get the short end of the stick and they'll be bad forever, essentially, even if they get a lot of effects put into their refines. I've probably mentioned it in the past, but more often than not, a weapon with 2 or 3 effects that synergize really well together is better than a weapon with twice or even 3 times the amount of effects that don't really complement one another. Having a clear direction with refines, regardless of the amount of effects, tends to lend itself better for not only general use, but aging. It's almost always quantity versus quality issues for basically anything in this game. However, in the case of modern day refines, not only is there an issue with non-synergetic effects in the refines, but the distribution of said effects. And it's why I believe a lot of refines this year just haven't been that good and at a higher rate as well. I would say before this book, or I guess this year, the quality of refines had been going up each year as a result of not only power creep, but also IS having a better idea of what refines should look like. Of course, you could easily find several duds from each year, but a lot of the time it was just due to not having a lot of baked effects into their refines to begin with. However, as far as this year is concerned, I believe that January had the best refine batch so far. February was okay to decent, and then it completely falls off a cliff, barring some outliers here and there, and it's because refines now have to give up some of their power budget to slot in 1 or 2 random support effects for the sake of it. It really feels like a retread of refines back when they were first introduced in 2018. There are parallels to old refines in the modern equivalents because all they're doing right now is stapling random effects onto them for no rhyme or reason. They definitely didn't have much of a direction with the former either, usually just taking the base weapon and adding an inheritable skill to it and calling it a day. It's why a lot of refines in the past were also extremely mediocre or bad, even for their time. However, the bar for quality was a lot different back then, so in a lot of cases, even if they weren't that great, they could still do something. Nowadays, you really have to get the right effects to be remotely usable, sometimes even needing the right movement type and stats alongside it, but it's really difficult for many units to do that because everything has to have combat and support now, and that means you end up having cases where their combat isn't good enough because some of the power budget had to go towards support, and it turns out their support isn't good enough either because a lot of the time they're just filler and don't really amount to anything in the end. And the worst part is, this isn't even exclusive to the refines. I feel like this is just a symptom with Book 9 as a whole. How many units can you name off the top of your head that are purely stuck in one role? For me, that's just Spring Plumeria, and she just supports. That's all she does. She dances and she sits there and she looks somewhat pretty. But besides Spring Plumeria, I can't think of any unit this year with a PRF that doesn't do something both combative and supportive. Every unit that was built for combat has to have some support, and every other support unit has to have some level of combat capabilities. That game design has also bled into refines as a whole too, but it's come at the cost of a lot of units not being able to make something worthwhile of their refines whatsoever. I think one of the greatest examples I could use here is Arc, and you know, at least hear me out before you rip me a new one. I know a lot of people like his refine. Just looking at general to be, it looks fairly solid on the surface, but the more you read into it, the more you realize that it has a lot of issues. His combat is very lackluster, to put it lightly. His support isn't that amazing despite giving out 3 bonuses because 2 of them are locked to tomes and staves in Treachery and Canto 1, the former getting nullified by the most common support effect in the game currently in Dull, which in turn also makes his combat worse and support worse. Not to mention, he's an infantry unit with a stat line that doesn't allow him to take advantage of more support because his archetype doesn't give him the opportunity to. You could try to do an AoE set with him or some magic allies, but there's so many units in the game that just heal back a lot of their HP at the start of combat anyway, especially with some of the statuses that just allows any unit to do that, and they're extremely common statuses. The only thing I can give him is that he is an easy source of no follow-up, which is fine, but that's not really good enough by itself, and because of that, what you're essentially left with is a unit that's trying to be both supportive and combative, and arguably failing in both roles. And look, I'm not here to strictly bash on him specifically for this. This is just something present in a lot of refines as of late. In fact, the opposite of this exact same thing can be seen with Fallen Dimitri's refine. I'm not about to say his refine is bad by any means because it isn't. The problem is that it's good for all the wrong reasons. Fallen Dimitri got a lot of combative upgrades to his PRF, including a bunch of attack and speed, damage reduction piercing on specials, a bunch of true damage, and some special jumps. Not too bad on its own. However, the sole thing carrying his weapon refine is the support built into it, which includes speed and defense penalties, panic, and undefended on the closest foes and any foe within 2 spaces of the target at the start of the turn. And it's because of this one effect that he's now a legitimate threat in basically every single game mode, and arguably a contender for one of the best refines of the year, which is really stupid. They built him for the sole purpose of combat, only to arguably want to enter a support role, which he can't do because he's a melee infantry with virtually no res stats. Genuinely, if you removed everything but the start of the turn undefended effect, I would argue that the refine would be just as good. And it's because of that Fallen Dimitri's refine really feels like a complete fluke, and I don't believe for a second that they even chose to give him that status on purpose. And the thing is, it's not like you couldn't use him in combat, but no one would have ever considered using Fallen Dimitri at all if he didn't have the map-wide, splashable, undefended built into his refine. And this is my biggest issue with refines right now. They don't have any form of direction, and a lot of the time, it really feels like they're just stapling on random stuff for the sake of it. I will at least give them some credit with some of the refines based on references or gimmicks from the main lines. That doesn't mean Alfric isn't still extremely bad, but at least there was some thought put into it, which is the last thing I could really say for a lot of the other modern refines. But it's because of this that modern refines end up either being bad or mixed at best, or great by random circumstance, with arguably the only exceptions being in units like Legendary Faye, Legendary Micaiah, Ronin, and Winter Bernadetta. I would say these were some of the only refines of the year so far that not only had a clear direction in what they wanted to do, but also got support that actually synergized with their roles and wasn't just filler for the sake of it, making them some of the better refines of the year. Not to say we didn't have other decent refines, Legendary Xander, Ashe, New Year's Caden, so on and so forth, although with the way I've been talking, you'd probably think it was like 99% trash. I would say it's like closer to 60 to 70%. And for what it's worth, it's not like the randomness hasn't benefited some units, but I would argue it was also by the same circumstance that Fallen Dimitri found himself in. Definitely not to the same level as Fallen Dimitri, of course, but just that general idea of randomly getting something that, oh, it somehow worked out after all. Just off the top of my script, you have Fernand, who's an anti-meta pick for some Summer Duel seasons because he got stall support in Flat Canto 2, which lends itself into some support options, even with Cleanse being more common. Sonya, who ended up aging pretty well because of the snakes fading out of the meta, being that she just so happened to get Essence Drain. And even though I put her on the other list, I would still add Winter Bernadetta and Marianne because there's a good chance that their refines would have looked a lot different if Brave Bernadetta and Rearmed Marianne weren't a thing before that point. And maybe there's like 1 or 2 other units, but it's not great regardless. And the thing is, I'm not even asking for every refine to be meta-defining, ultra-busted nonsense. I just want them to at least make them more functional, or at the very least more thought out, because it very much seems like right now they're just throwing darts at a board to determine what each refine gets. Except for the 7 HP after combat effect, because 99% of the refines we got so far come with that guaranteed for some reason. I personally have 2 bars for determining the quality of any refine, and ultimately a lot of it will vary by the unit, but generally speaking, it fits more or less most molds. The first bar, and arguably the most malleable bar, is that the refine is better than any inheritable option the unit in question has access to. This will vary significantly by weapon types because sometimes it really is just better than nothing, even if the weapon itself isn't even that good. In the scenario where the refine is better than, let's say, a recent arcane, or you can make a valid case for keeping it over anything else, then I think the refine enters the okay to decent range. The second bar, and the one that is not nearly as feasible for many refines, is whether the refine allows a unit to have some sort of niche in a game mode or two, primarily Aether Raids or Summoner Duels. And not like, oh, well, I can bring Miranda to Aether Raids or Summoner Duels, but I'm gonna hate myself for doing it. Not like that. I mean, if you bring them and they can actively contribute something worthwhile. If they can at least do that, then I would argue the refine, at minimum, is good. And anything after that just varies on effectiveness for the most part, but I don't think it's much of an ask. You could argue that these standards are too much or too high and set up unrealistic expectations in general, but I don't really agree in the slightest. I don't think it's much of an ask to get effects in a refine that synergize with one another, especially since they just keep shoving support into every refine now. It really doesn't even have to be groundbreaking either, just worthwhile enough. Although it also doesn't help that a lot of support effects right now just aren't good, like flash and bonus doubler, so those by default won't get a lot of mileage, but I don't think it would even be that difficult to have the tacked on support work with combat effects. Great example, Luthier just got a refine, and he gives out some support in stat swings, dull, and guard. And the rest of his refine is just some generic combat stuff that doesn't really help him in that role in the slightest. They could have given him full tempo during combat and even some pierceable damage reduction alongside it, and suddenly he's a moderately bulky initiator who can prevent a decent amount of specials from charging. That's something, right? Or even Peleus, who just gives out orders and breath just for the sake of it. Why not give him some special jumps depending on the amount of space his moves so he can not only have a better combat niche, but also justify the order status a bit more? There's probably a lot of other examples I can make, and the thing is, these wouldn't even be that crazy either, but they'd sure work a lot better than the state they're currently in. It's part of the reason why I wasn't even harsh on Lex's refine. He just got a bunch of effects that leaned into his combat, like easier quads, true damage, and breath, and it was fine for like a month, but still, it was fine. It also doesn't help that refined units just aren't that common for the most part unless they're either supportive, which effectively makes them super cheap to use, or they're extremely popular like brave heroes or some legendaries who are already owned by a majority of the player base. I don't think a refined unit not being common is really a determinant of whether the refine was actually good or not, because most of the time it's just ridiculously expensive to get off the ground. Even with rarity as a factor, which can affect it at times, the core issue comes from the cost of it all. Why would somebody spend 2 to 4 5-star units to get one refined unit going when they can either use those resources towards something else or just grab a newer unit that does the job well enough or even better in some cases? Investing into refined units is always so expensive, so it really just never becomes worth it a lot of the time. And if you ever do see units like that around, then it's most likely because people were already invested in those units before the refine. I'm not sure if that affects the decision process behind refines or not, but in my mind, it means there's less of an incentive to make them better, especially if they want to sell people on newer stuff. Why would they actively go out of their way to try and make something older better? At least if they took the opportunity to cash in on older refines a bit more by selling them in hollow forms or something, it would make sense for them to try harder, but that's rarely the case, if ever. So if a unit ends up getting a pretty worthwhile refine, it's more likely that it was by sheer luck than anything substantial. Other than that, we're a bit more than halfway through the year, and I'm not confident it's going to get that much better anytime soon. Maybe I'll eat those words, and honestly, I really hope I do, because it's not that great seeing a bunch of units wait years for a refine, only for it to just be a placeholder for the next arcane weapon. Not to mention, it's a lot more interesting seeing a straightforward, synergetic refine that can at least do their job, as opposed to the mess of effects that everybody gets nowadays that don't work together or provide any niche in any role. Still, I think until they get out of what I'm going to dub the refined growing pains, I think expectations should be kept at a minimum. And then those expectations should be lowered even more just to be safe. That or power creep gets to the point where they can give out filler effects without expending too much of a refine's power budget. But until then, you better hold out some hope a unit you care about gets something remotely decent. 3 hopes, ideally.